It was September of 2020, the kind of late summer night when Missouri's farmland falls silent, the only sound the wind in the trees and the hum of insects in the fields. But somewhere on the outskirts of Stott City, silence was shattered. Two friends, Melissa Pugh, 30 years old, and 27-year-old Sarah Pasco, thought they were ending their evening like so many before. They sat in Melissa's car, parked quietly, talking the way friends do when the world outside feels still. Then, out of the shadows, a man approached. His name was Samuel Hunter Jr. He was armed, and he was not alone. At gunpoint, Melissa and Sarah were forced to drive to a nearby home, the home of an accomplice named Christina Knapp. But this was not a burglary. It was not a robbery that would end at a cash register or with a stolen car. Over the next several hours, what began as a single man with a weapon grew into a circle of 9. 9 people who would hold these women captive. 9 people who would stand by, silent, as Hunter took control of their lives. In that yard, beneath a dim porch light, Melissa and Sarah were ordered to dig their own graves. Soil piled high under their fingernails. Sweat clung to their faces, and every breath carried the taste of fear. Neighbors slept quietly just yards away, never knowing the horror that was unfolding in plain sight. Melissa later recalled that moment. Not just the digging, but the silence of the people around her. None of them spoke up. Not one tried to stop him. Even as Hunter held the gun, even as the shovels struck earth, they all watched, and they all let it happen. When the graves were dug, Hunter decided it wasn't enough. He ordered his followers to load the women into 2 cars and drive them deeper into the country to the outskirts of Miller. There, hidden in the woods, stood an abandoned well, dark, deep, and waiting. Melissa and Sarah were forced to the edge, hands shaking, knees buckling, their last moments together bound not by choice, but by terror. Then, one gunshot. The sound ripped through the trees. Sarah Pasco collapsed into the darkness. Her body struck the stone walls on the way down, the silence afterward more deafening than the shot itself. Melissa fell too, her body pressed against her friend's. But unlike Sarah, Melissa was still alive. Heart pounding, lungs burning, she did the only thing she could. She went still. She did not move. She did not breathe. She became what Hunter believed she was. Dead. As footsteps faded, Melissa remained in the pit of the earth, buried beneath the weight of her friend's body. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. She lay motionless, trapped between survival and death. And then, when the last sound of engines rolling away disappeared into the Missouri night, Melissa pushed herself upward. She clawed past the stone walls, past the body of her friend, past the fear that had nearly consumed her, and she emerged. Somehow, with trembling hands, she found her phone. Somehow, she dialed 911. Her voice broke as she spoke to the dispatcher. It was barely a whisper, but it carried everything: the fear, the shock, the horror of what had just happened. Lawrence County 911. What's your emergency? Melissa, breathless, trembling. Please, help me. My friend is dead. They shot us. I'm in a well. Please hurry. In that moment, Melissa Pugh wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor whose testimony, whose courage would bring an entire group of 9 into the light of justice. Before the gunshot cracked the silence in those Missouri woods, this was a story about 2 women and the small towns they called home. Melissa Pugh, in her early 30s, was known as someone who leaned on faith. Friends said she was strong in spirit, someone who showed up for people when they needed her. She was hardworking, the kind of woman who believed that trials were tests and that survival, even through the hardest storms, was possible with God's hand guiding her way. Her friend, Sarah Pasco, just 27 years old, was described as loyal, bright, and deeply loved by her family. She was a daughter, a sister, and a mother. Sarah's world was built around those she cared for. To the people of Aurora, she was someone who didn't look for trouble. She didn't chase chaos. She wanted stability, family barbecues, Sunday mornings at church, birthdays celebrated with laughter. On the night of August 16th, 2020, they weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. Two friends in a car, talking, passing time. But in small-town Missouri, ordinary can vanish in an instant. Because this was also the story of another man, Gary Wayne Hunter Jr., 23 years old, from Mount Vernon, with a reputation that was not unknown. Hunter wasn't some stranger wandering into Lawrence County. He was part of it, part of a web of relationships, acquaintances, and, according to law enforcement, drug disputes. Sheriff Brad DeLay later explained that Hunter Jr.'s rage that night may have been tied to a drug deal gone bad. Anger over money, anger over heroin. Whether Melissa was truly involved in that transaction remains contested. What is clear is this: Sarah was not. She was collateral, sitting in that car because she trusted her friend, because she had no way of knowing what was about to happen. But Hunter didn't come alone. Over the course of that night, he pulled in 8 others, some neighbors, some acquaintances, some friends. Christina Knapp, whose property in Stott City would become part of the crime scene. Stephen Calverley, a 33-year-old former Marine, a Purple Heart recipient. Diana Parks, Lyle DeLong, Andrew Cypret, Kimberly Henderson, Sierra Dunham, Frank Sheridan. 9 people together. Each one had a role to play. Some drove cars, some supplied weapons, some stood guard, and some, prosecutors argued, simply stood by and did nothing at all. Why? That is the question that still unsettles this story. Why did Calverley, a decorated veteran, a man trained to act under fire, fail to intervene when 2 women were forced into the ground, digging their own graves? In court, Melissa herself would ask him that question. She said, "I know God spared my life for a reason, but I don't understand why none of them tried to help us, especially with Mr. Calverley being a war hero." Calverley admitted his failure. In a courtroom filled with silence, he read a letter of apology. "I'm sorry I was a coward and didn't try harder to stop him. I'm sorry I didn't call 911 and report it. I'm sorry I didn't try to put myself between him and you guys." Why did Christina Knapp open her home as a staging ground? What was her connection to Hunter Jr.? Was she under pressure or was she willing? She would later plead guilty to robbery and kidnapping, sentenced to 25 years. But what really made her unlock her door that night remains a question worth pressing. And what about the others? Parks, DeLong, Cypret, Henderson, Dunham, Sheridan. Some were there through direct participation, others through silence. What ties pulled them into Hunter's orbit? Was it loyalty, fear, or a shared reliance on the same undercurrents of drugs and debt that run beneath rural America? These questions linger because Lawrence County was the kind of place where, on the surface, everyone knew everyone. People greeted each other in diners, passed each other on the 2-lane highways, nodded in church pews. But underneath, there were cracks. Whispers of meth labs in farmhouses, small-time heroin transactions, neighbors looking the other way. Did people in the community see this coming? Was Hunter already known as dangerous? Could someone have sounded the alarm earlier? For Melissa and Sarah, those questions wouldn't matter. What mattered was the here and now, the moment Hunter pulled the gun, ordered them to drive, and set off a chain of terror. That night would expose not only the fragility of life, but the fragility of choice. Every person involved was given a chance. The chance to walk away, the chance to stop what was unfolding, the chance to speak up. None did. And that is what makes this case so chilling. It wasn't the act of one man, but of many. A collective silence, a collective complicity. As dawn broke the next morning, the people of Lawrence County woke to headlines they never thought would be theirs. 2 women, kidnapped, 1 shot dead, 1 left for dead in an abandoned well, 9 suspects. It would be Melissa Pugh's survival, her decision to remain perfectly still under the weight of her friend's body, her climb out of the darkness, her trembling call to 911. That would begin to unravel the truth. But before detectives pieced together the investigation, before prosecutors laid out the indictments, the questions lingered. Who were these people? How had they lived among their neighbours unnoticed? And why did so many choose silence over saving a life? August 16th, 2020, just past midnight. A young woman emerges from the shadows of the Miller Woods, her clothes torn, her body soaked in dirt and blood. Behind her, a well. Inside it, her best friend's lifeless body. This is not the kind of call that deputies in Lawrence County receive often. When the dispatcher picked up Melissa Pugh's 911 call, what came through was panic, a raw, gasping voice trying to explain the unthinkable. 2 women, kidnapped, driven from town to town, forced into a well. 1 shot dead. Melissa Pugh was alive, but only barely. Her body carried the shock of trauma. Her spirit, though, shaken, trembling, still carried enough strength to tell police what had happened. Deputies rushed to the scene, headlights tearing through the blackened country roads. What they found was exactly what Melissa had described: an abandoned well, a fresh crime scene, and a horror that would ripple across the county. Sarah Pasco's body was recovered from the well, her life cut short at just 27 years old. For investigators, the scene told part of the story, but the rest would come from Melissa, whose memory of every moment that night would become the backbone of the case. Based on trial testimony from Melissa, he made us dig. He laughed while we cried. He told us this was our grave. When he shot Sarah, I didn't move. I laid under her. I had to. I thought if I moved, he'd shoot me too. I thought that was it. But when he left, I crawled out. I just kept running until I found someone to help. What Melissa described set off an investigation unlike anything Lawrence County had seen in years. Sheriff Brad DeLay and his deputies were faced with a crime not of one man acting alone, but of an entire group. And the names began to surface quickly. The ringleader, Gary Wayne Hunter Jr., 23 years old, already known to law enforcement. Investigators linked him to drug activity, disputes, and a violent streak that was no secret to those who knew him. But he hadn't acted alone. In fact, over the span of just hours, Hunter pulled in 8 other people, each of them complicit in a different way. Christina Knapp, who opened her property in Stott City for the women to be held, where graves were dug in her yard. She later pleaded guilty to robbery and kidnapping. Stephen Calverley, a 33-year-old US Marine veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, who stood by as Hunter forced 2 women into the ground. Diana Parks, Lyle DeLong, Andrew Cypriot, Kimberly Henderson, Sierra Dunham, and Frank Sheridan, each pulled in by choice, fear, or circumstance, but each later indicted as part of a conspiracy that led to murder. For detectives, it was an unraveling thread. One name led to another, one arrest to the next. By the end of the week, all 9 suspects were in custody, but arrests were only the beginning. Investigators now faced the harder question: how do you prove who did what when so many were involved? Melissa's testimony became critical. She had seen their faces, she had heard their voices, she knew who gave orders and who followed them. And then came the contradictions. Some suspects claimed they were just bystanders. Others blamed Hunter alone. Some pleaded guilty to lesser charges: kidnapping, robbery, armed criminal action. Only one, Stephen Calverley, took his chances at trial. For Melissa, facing him in court was its own kind of nightmare. Here was a man she once might have called a protector, a decorated Marine, trained in sacrifice, and yet he had done nothing. In her testimony, she looked him in the eye and asked the question no one else could answer. Why didn't you stop him? Calverley's answer came not in defiance, but in shame. He admitted his cowardice, saying, "I'm sorry I didn't put myself between him and you guys. I'm sorry I didn't call 911. I'm sorry I didn't stop him." His words rang hollow to many, because for Sarah's family, an apology couldn't erase the silence of that night. In small-town Missouri, where neighbors often carry unspoken bonds, the betrayal was hard to process. 9 people, some of them with families, some with decorated service, some with long histories of struggle, had either helped or refused to help. The investigation revealed layers of complicity. Some suspects admitted to digging. Others admitted to standing watch. A few claimed they only followed Hunter's orders out of fear. But fear does not absolve guilt, and in the eyes of the law, silence in the face of violence makes you complicit. Step by step, prosecutors built the case. Witness testimonies, forensic evidence from Knapp's yard, phone records tying the suspects together, Melissa's own survival, a living testimony of what unfolded. By late 2021, sentences began to fall. Hunter Jr., the ringleader, received life in prison without parole. Knapp, 25 years. Others received varied sentences, depending on their role. And Calverley, after going to trial, was convicted not only by the law, but by Melissa's haunting words. For Melissa, surviving that night was only the beginning of her burden. Testifying meant reliving the fear, every detail, every sound of dirt scraping, every echo of Hunter's voice. She told the court she had forgiven, but forgiveness did not mean forgetting. And forgiveness did not mean answers. Why did no one stop him? Why did 9 people choose silence over courage? Why did Sarah have to die? Those are questions that linger in the cracks of this story. As the trials wrapped up and sentences were handed down, the people of Lawrence County were left with a crime that shook the very foundation of small-town trust. Neighbors wondered, how many other secrets lie behind closed doors? For Melissa, every day since has been marked by one haunting truth. She survived, but survival means carrying the weight of every detail, every question, every moment that night. And as the investigation closed, another chapter began, the reckoning of a town forced to face the evil it never thought would reach its quiet fields. The arrests were only the beginning. 9 suspects, 1 murdered victim, 1 survivor. But how do you prosecute a crime committed not by one man, but by an entire group, each with a different role, each carrying a different level of guilt? For Lawrence County prosecutors, the case was a web of complicity. At its center, Gary Wayne Hunter Jr., the ringleader. But surrounding him, like shadows, were 8 others who followed his lead. The strategy was clear: flip the weaker links. Secure guilty pleas from those willing to admit their roles. Use those testimonies against the others. And, above all, build the case on the unshakable word of the survivor, Melissa Pugh. When Melissa walked into the courtroom, every eye was on her. This was not just testimony. This was survival on display. She told the jury what happened, step by step. The graves dug in Knapp's yard, the drive through rural backroads, the final walk into the woods, the gunshot. Her words were graphic, but they carried a weight that evidence alone could not. She was living proof that Hunter and his accomplices had not just threatened, but carried out their intent to kill. And in that courtroom, the truth was laid bare. Sarah Pasco was dead. Melissa Pugh was alive. And 9 people had taken part in the journey that led them to the edge of the well. Hunter Jr. faced the heaviest charge, first-degree murder. His role was clear, his violence undisputed. He was sentenced to life without parole. Others, like Christina Knapp, pleaded guilty to kidnapping and robbery. Her sentence, 25 years in prison. But one man chose not to plead. He wanted his day in court, and it was his trial that would reopen every wound for Melissa. His name was Stephen Calverley, a decorated US Marine, Purple Heart recipient, a man trained to defend and protect. But on that night, he had done nothing. Based on dialogue from reports with Melissa, on the stand, I know God spared my life for a reason, but I don't understand why none of them tried to help us, especially with Mr. Calverley being a war hero. Narrator, the words cut deep, not just for Calverley, but for everyone listening. In a town where military service is honoured, where veterans are symbols of sacrifice, the idea of a Marine standing by while two women were terrorised was almost unthinkable. When it was his turn to speak, Calverley did not deny it. He did not offer excuses. Instead, he admitted his failure in a letter read aloud to the court. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, but I want you to know I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was a coward and didn't try harder to stop him. I'm sorry I didn't call 911. I'm sorry I didn't try to put myself between him and you guys." For some, it was remorse. For others, it was too little, too late. The jury saw it for what it was, complicity, and they convicted him. For Sarah's family, the trials were not victories, they were reminders. Each sentence handed down could not bring Sarah back. Each apology rang hollow against the silence of her absence. Her parents described her as loyal, loving, the kind of friend who stood by people even in their darkest hours. For them, losing her to violence this senseless left wounds that courtrooms could not close. Melissa's survival brought relief, but it also carried its own burden. Survivor's guilt, the memory of lying beneath her best friend's body, the constant question, why Sarah and not me? These were the questions that lingered long after the gavel fell. By the end of 2021, the case had reached its legal conclusion. Sentences were handed down. Hunter was behind bars for life. His accomplices scattered across Missouri prisons. But outside the courthouse, in the quiet streets of Lawrence County, the echoes of the crime remained. Neighbors asked, how could 9 people watch, participate, or remain silent in the face of such cruelty? The trials provided answers to the question of guilt. But they left behind another, far heavier question, one that no court could resolve. What drives ordinary people, neighbors, acquaintances, even veterans, to stand by and allow evil to unfold in front of them? As the courtroom doors closed and the sentences were read, Missouri was left with more than just a legal victory. It was left with a mirror, one that reflected back the darkest parts of human nature. And yet, within that darkness, there was still a light. Melissa Pugh's voice, trembling but unbroken, became the voice that carried Sarah's story to the world. But even as justice was delivered, the question remained, was it enough? By the time the case against Hunter Jr. and his accomplices reached trial, the story had already spread beyond Miller, Missouri. Local papers carried the headlines. Regional TV stations ran segments about the woman who survived the well. And even national outlets briefly picked up the story. But in the courthouse, the spectacle was stripped bare. It was about evidence, witnesses, and whether the state could prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. This was the part of the story John Grisham might have written himself. The slow, deliberate grind of justice with lives on the line and lawyers circling each other like predators. Every strong case needs its linchpin, the one piece of evidence that turns suspicion into certainty. For prosecutors, the turning point came with a combination of cell phone data and ballistics. Ballistics, the shell casings recovered from the well site were matched to a handgun later seized during a raid on Hunter's residence. While the weapon had been hastily wiped, forensic technicians lifted a partial fingerprint from the magazine. It wasn't enough to convict alone, but it linked Hunter to the weapon. Cell phone data. Investigators subpoenaed Hunter's phone records. A tower ping placed his device within a mile of the abandoned well at the exact time Melissa said the attack occurred. Defense lawyers would argue it proved nothing. Lots of people drive past that area. But combined with Melissa's testimony, the data gave prosecutors the timeline they needed. The breakthrough wasn't a dramatic smoking gun. It was the quiet, methodical assembly of puzzle pieces that together painted a picture jurors couldn't ignore. The trial began under tight security. Hunter sat flanked by defense attorneys, wearing a pressed shirt and tie, his hair neatly combed, a sharp contrast to the violent figure Melissa described. The two alleged accomplices, tried separately, were watching closely. The outcome of Hunter's case would set the tone for their own. Prosecutor Don Trotter, a methodical man with years of courtroom experience, opened with a stark declaration. This is a case about control, violence, and survival. The defendant believed he could erase 2 young women from this earth without consequence, but one survived, and she is here today. The defense countered with skepticism. This case relies on the word of one traumatized woman. Memory is fragile. Fear clouds judgment. We ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to look past the emotion and focus only on evidence. It was a strategy as old as trial law itself. Dismantle the credibility of the witness, plant seeds of doubt, and hope they grow into reasonable doubt. The courtroom fell silent when Melissa walked to the witness box. She had spent months preparing with victim advocates, prosecutors, and therapists, but nothing could truly ready her for facing Hunter again. Her testimony was steady, though her hands shook as she gripped the microphone. She described the kidnapping, the forced march into the woods, the moment Sarah was shot, and the suffocating weight of lying beneath her friend's body, pretending to be dead. At one point, her voice broke. I could feel her blood on me. I thought if I breathed too loud, he'd hear me. So I just stopped. I stopped everything until I couldn't anymore. Jurors watched intently. Some glanced away, visibly shaken. When the defense cross-examined, their approach was sharp but calculated. Why hadn't Melissa seen the gun clearly in the dark? Was she sure it was Hunter's voice? Could trauma have distorted her memory? But Melissa didn't falter. She answered firmly, sometimes even turning toward the jury. I will never forget his voice. He thought I was dead. He leaned over the well and said, "That's done. I'll never forget it." Prosecutors bolstered Melissa's testimony with a series of witnesses. Forensic experts explained the ballistics and cell phone evidence. Neighbors testified to Hunter's reputation, his temper, his control over younger men, his late-night movements around the time of the crime. Accomplice testimony. Perhaps most damning, one of the younger men who had been with Hunter that night eventually took a plea deal. His account mirrored Melissa's. Hunter had orchestrated the kidnapping, Hunter had pulled the trigger, and Hunter had ordered the disposal of the bodies. Defense lawyers hammered at inconsistencies in the accomplice's story, arguing he was simply trying to save himself. But combined with Melissa's unwavering testimony, the picture of Hunter as the ringleader became hard to deny. Like any trial of this magnitude, moments of drama unfolded. A witness under pressure. When the accomplice testified, he visibly trembled. At one point, defense counsel accused him of lying to secure a lighter sentence. He snapped back. "You weren't there." "I saw what he did. I saw her fall." The jury's attention. Jurors scribbled notes during forensic testimony, but leaned forward during Melissa's account. Observers said you could feel the weight in the room. Hunter's demeanor. Throughout, Hunter remained stoic. Occasionally, he whispered to his attorneys, but when Melissa pointed at him and identified him as the man who shot Sarah, he smirked, just enough for jurors to notice. Prosecutor Trotter's closing was deliberate. designed to echo in jurors' minds long after they left the courtroom. 2 women were marched to their deaths. One was executed. The other, by sheer will, survived to tell us what happened. The evidence matches her words, the phone records, the gun, the accomplice. Every piece points to one man. The defendant sitting before you thought he buried the truth at the bottom of a well. But the truth climbed out. The defense countered with an appeal to doubt. This case rests on the shaky testimony of a traumatized survivor and a self-serving accomplice. Ask yourselves, do you truly know what happened in those woods, or are you being asked to believe a story that fits too neatly? The jury deliberated for hours that stretched into a full day. When they returned, the room stilled. The foreman's voice was clear. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and armed criminal action. Melissa wept. Sarah's family clutched each other in silent relief. Hunter sat stone-faced, but his eyes betrayed a flash of fury. The judge sentenced him to life without parole, a permanent end to his reign of control. The trial wasn't just about one murder. It became a test of resilience, of Melissa's courage, of small-town law enforcement's ability to tackle a crime that could have been buried forever, and of a justice system straining under the weight of trauma and fear. For many in Miller, it reaffirmed that even in the darkest crimes, the truth can claw its way back to light, if survivors find the strength to speak, and if jurors find the will to listen. The verdict against Hunter Jr. was meant to be the final word, the hammer of justice sealing the case shut. But in small-town Missouri, justice rarely ends neatly. The aftershocks of Sarah Pasco's murder, Melissa Pugh's survival, and the trial's outcome rippled outward, through families, communities, and even the justice system itself. This act isn't about the crime itself. It's about what lingers when the courtroom lights dim, the reporters pack up, and the victims and families are left to face what's been lost forever. Melissa Pugh, once an ordinary woman from Stott City, became a name that carried both tragedy and resilience. She had survived the unimaginable. But survival, she would later say, is not the same as living. Nightmares plagued her. In interviews, she described waking up drenched in sweat, convinced she could still hear the gunshot, still feel Sarah's body pressed against her. "I know God spared my life for a reason," she testified during the sentencing hearing. "But I don't understand why none of them tried to help us, especially with Mr. Calverley being a war hero." Her words revealed a truth deeper than legal guilt. Survival had left her with questions that no verdict could answer. Why had no one intervened? Why had grown men, including a decorated Marine, stood silent as Hunter terrorized 2 unarmed women? For Sarah's family, closure was elusive. They had sat through every day of testimony, forced to relive the final moments of their daughter's life through the words of strangers. Her parents described Sarah as loyal, funny, the kind of daughter who lit up a room simply by walking into it. She was just hanging out with her friend. They were sitting in the car, minding their own business. They had no idea what kind of evil was about to walk up, her mother told local reporters. At vigils in her honor, candles flickered in the cool Missouri night. Friends spoke of her generosity, her laughter, her love for family. But grief always carried a sharper edge. The knowledge that Sarah had been robbed of decades she should have lived. Her family pressed forward with memorial scholarships in her name, determined to turn their pain into a lasting tribute. Still, no gesture could ever fill the silence she left behind. Hunter Jr. had not acted alone. Over the course of the investigation, 9 suspects were arrested. Each had played a role, some more direct than others, in the abduction, confinement, and eventual execution of Sarah and the attempted execution of Melissa. Christina Knapp, who allowed her property to be used as a staging ground, pleaded guilty to robbery and kidnapping. She was sentenced, But her punishment was lighter than Hunter's, something that angered Sarah's family. James Calverley, the Marine veteran, stood out as the most perplexing. During his trial, Melissa told him she forgave him, but her words carried a bite. "I just don't understand why you didn't try to stop him." His Purple Heart, once a symbol of courage, became a symbol of failure to act when courage was needed most. Calverley expressed remorse. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, but I want you to know I am sorry. I'm sorry I was a coward and didn't try harder to stop him. I'm sorry I didn't call 911 and report it. I'm sorry I didn't try to put myself between him and you guys." But remorse, however sincere, could not erase what happened in the woods that night. His sentence reflected complicity, even if not the trigger pull. The unraveling truth was that Hunter did not need a gang of hardened criminals to carry out his crime. He relied on ordinary people, neighbors, acquaintances, friends, who allowed themselves to be swept along in his violent current. In Miller and nearby Stott City, the case left a scar. This was a place where people left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew each other's names, where life was supposed to be simple. Suddenly, the headlines screamed of grave digging, abduction, and execution-style murder. Neighbors asked, how had 9 people been pulled into something so horrific? How had no one at any point stepped away or called police? One local pastor put it bluntly in a sermon. "Evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from people we know, and it thrives when good men do nothing." Even after the verdicts, unanswered questions gnawed at the edges of the case. Why did Hunter Jr. target Melissa and Sarah? Was it random? Was there a personal connection never fully uncovered? Investigators insisted it began with chance. A man with a gun approaching 2 women in a parked car. But many in town speculated there had to be more. Could this have been prevented? The accomplices had multiple chances to stop it. Why did none of them act? Fear of Hunter? Or something darker, shared cruelty? What does justice mean in a case like this? A guilty verdict doesn't restore a life. It doesn't erase the trauma. It doesn't answer Melissa's most haunting question. Why me and not her? The case became a cautionary tale across Missouri. Training programs for law enforcement pointed to it as an example of how trauma survivors like Melissa could be both vulnerable and invaluable in securing convictions. Advocacy groups highlighted the courage it takes to testify against one's attackers, especially in a small community where faces are familiar. And in a broader sense, it stirred discussions about complicity. How many crimes are sustained not only by the perpetrator's violence, but by the silence of those who stand nearby and do nothing? The final twist wasn't a hidden witness or a surprise confession. It was the sobering realization that the true horror of the Missouri kidnapping wasn't just what happened in the woods. It was how many people had the chance to prevent it and didn't. Hunter pulled the trigger, but without the help, or at least the passivity, of 8 others, Melissa and Sarah might never have ended up at that well. Justice punished Hunter with life in prison. It punished his accomplices with lesser but still weighty sentences. But justice could not erase the truth Melissa carried. That survival came at the cost of her best friend's life. In the end, the courtroom delivered its verdict. But for Melissa, Sarah's family, and the town of Miller, the case left a deeper question. One that no judge or jury could ever fully answer. What does it mean to live with the knowledge that the people around you, neighbors, friends, even war heroes, chose silence when faced with evil? Justice, in the end, is just a word. The truth is far heavier, and for Melissa Pugh, the truth will always begin at the bottom of a well, in the silence of the Missouri woods, where one life ended and another was forever changed. Asterisk. For Melissa Pugh, survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a lifetime of carrying the memory of her best friend, Sarah Pasco, a young woman whose future was stolen in a single gunshot. For the people of Miller, Missouri, this case was more than a crime. It was a revelation that in the heart of small-town America, where faith and community are supposed to protect you, evil can still take root, and ordinary people can be drawn into it by fear, loyalty, or silence. 9 were arrested. 1 was convicted of murder. Sentences were handed down. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. But no verdict can erase what happened that night in the woods. No prison sentence can bring Sarah back. And no testimony can fully explain why so many stood by while terror unfolded in front of them. In the end, this case leaves us with a haunting reminder. Justice may punish the guilty, but it cannot heal the living. For Melissa, the truth will always be measured not in verdicts, but in the sound of a gunshot in the Missouri night and the silence that followed. What do you think? Did justice truly prevail in the Missouri kidnapping case? Or does this story reveal deeper failures in how communities respond to evil? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth true crime documentaries, and join us next time as we uncover another case that left a town forever changed.